Hello, and welcome to Code Your English, the channel where we explore not just how to speak better English, but how to live more deeply, more consciously, and more connected to ourselves and the world around us. I'm really glad you're here. Today, we're diving into a quiet topic, but one that speaks loudly inside all of us. I've called this episode The Silent Battle: How to Win the War Within Yourself. Because, whether we talk about it or not, most of us are fighting a war no one else can see. You know the kind I mean. It's not a war with other people. It's not about arguments or politics or conflict out in the world. It's something much more subtle and much more constant. It's the struggle that takes place in the space between our thoughts. It's that tension between who we are and who we think we should be. That daily friction between your dreams and your doubts, your potential and your fear. Some people call it mental noise. Others call it the inner critic. Maybe you've heard those phrases before, but let's slow down and unpack them a bit. Your inner critic is that voice in your head that points out every mistake, every flaw, every reason why you might not be good enough. It often shows up when you're about to do something brave, like applying for a job, speaking in public, or simply trying something new. And mental noise refers to the constant stream of thoughts, worries, self-judgments, and distractions that run through your mind on repeat. It's like having a radio playing in the background, except the volume keeps going up, and you can't find the off switch. And here's the thing. We all have this voice. We all experience that noise. But we don't always talk about it, especially in professional environments, where people expect you to be confident, composed, and in control. So instead, we hide it. We smile on the outside while fighting battles on the inside. And that's why I think this topic matters, not just for your personal growth, but for your English learning too. Because language isn't just grammar and vocabulary, it's also the way we give shape to our thoughts. The way we talk to ourselves influences the way we communicate with others. So let me ask you this, and feel free to just pause and reflect for a moment. What are you fighting for? Or maybe, what are you fighting against? Is it the fear of failure? The pressure to prove yourself? The voice in your head that says, you're not ready, not smart enough, not capable? Wherever you are in life right now, whether you're a student, a professional, a parent, an entrepreneur, chances are you've felt that invisible weight, that internal pressure to keep it all together while silently wondering if you're doing enough, being enough, living enough. This silent battle is more common than we realize. And yet, it's also deeply personal. No two people experience it in exactly the same way. But here's the good news. And yes, there is good news. You can learn to navigate it. You can learn to understand it. And slowly but surely, you can start to win that war, not by fighting harder, but by becoming wiser about what's actually going on inside your mind. In this episode, we're going to explore how that happens. We'll look at where these internal struggles come from, how to notice them without getting overwhelmed, and what it really means to transform your internal dialogue. Because, believe it or not, some of the most important conversations you'll ever have will be the ones you have with yourself. So wherever you are, maybe walking through a park, sitting on a train, or just relaxing with a cup of coffee, I invite you to take a deep breath and come with me. Let's go beneath the surface. Let's decode the patterns. And let's begin the journey of winning the war within yourself. Not with force, but with awareness. You ready? Let's begin. Understanding the battlefield. Your mind as terrain. In the last part of this episode, we started exploring what I called the silent battle, that inner struggle so many of us experience but rarely talk about out loud. And now, in this next part, I want to take you a little deeper into that experience. Because before you can win any battle, even a quiet, invisible one, you need to understand the terrain. In other words, you need to know where you're standing, what kind of ground you're walking on, what kind of mental space you're living in every day. Let's call this your internal landscape, the mental and emotional world inside you that nobody else can see, but that affects everything. Your choices, your reactions, your energy, even your ability to learn and grow. Just like the earth has mountains, valleys, rivers, deserts, your mind has its own terrain too. Some parts are calm and open, places where ideas flow easily and confidence feels natural. Other parts might feel more like quicksand, where you keep sinking into doubt, overthinking, or fear of judgment. And just like real landscapes, your mental terrain is shaped over time by your experiences, your upbringing, your environment, and your beliefs. This is where we begin to see how powerful our thought patterns, mental habits, and emotional conditioning can be. These patterns often run on autopilot, meaning we don't even notice them. They become the background music of our lives, familiar, repetitive, and quietly influential. Think about it for a moment. When you face a challenge, what's your default reaction? Do you immediately doubt yourself? Do you blame others? Do you shut down emotionally? Or do you go into fix-it mode and try to stay busy, just to avoid the uncomfortable feelings underneath? These patterns, the ones that repeat again and again, are clues. They reveal how your inner terrain is structured. They show you where the emotional weather tends to change. Now, emotional weather is a metaphor I love. Imagine waking up and finding that it's raining in your mind. Heavy thoughts, dark moods, no motivation. Or maybe it's windy. Everything feels chaotic, disorganized, loud. Some days are foggy, unclear thoughts, no direction. And other days, sunshine, clarity, focus, optimism. What's important to understand here is that just like real weather, your emotional state isn't fixed. It moves, it shifts, it passes. But some of us mistake the weather for the landscape. We feel sad or anxious and think, this is who I am. When in fact, it might just be a storm passing through. The deeper terrain, your values, your resilience, your capacity for joy, is still there underneath. It hasn't disappeared. It's just hidden, temporarily, by clouds. But some parts of the terrain are more permanent. Over the years, as we go through difficult or repeated experiences, maybe rejection, criticism, failure, our minds start to form what we might call fault lines. These are the weak spots, the places where old pain still lives, just below the surface. And when something presses on those areas, a harsh comment, a reminder of a past failure, even just a tone of voice, it can trigger a much bigger reaction than the situation really deserves. That's when the inner battle intensifies, not because the situation is huge, but because it's touched a part of you that hasn't fully healed yet. Understanding these fault lines, and the patterns around them, is one of the most powerful steps you can take. And this is where language, especially emotional vocabulary, becomes a tool for awareness. Can you describe what happens in your mind when you feel discouraged? Do you know the words for the thoughts that tend to come up? Things like, I'm not good enough. Why do I even try? Or, everyone else seems to have it together but me. The more precisely you can name the experience, the more power you have to shift it. So, here's a gentle challenge for you. Map your mental terrain. I mean that metaphorically, of course. Grab a notebook or just think it through in your head. Ask yourself, where do I feel most confident and free? What kind of situations bring out the best in me? And on the other hand, where do I tend to get stuck? What thoughts or emotions tend to repeat themselves, especially when I'm under pressure? And by the way, don't judge yourself while doing this. You're not trying to fix anything here. You're just observing. This is about becoming familiar with your own inner world, so that it stops controlling you from the shadows. Because the truth is, we can't change what we don't recognize. And most of the time, we're not really choosing our thoughts. We're just reacting to them, without even realizing it. So here's another question for you to reflect on. Maybe even pause the episode and sit with it for a minute. Are you living inside a mental landscape that supports you, or one that drains you? Do your daily thoughts give you energy, or steal it? Does your inner dialogue open doors, or build walls? Now, none of this is easy work. Looking inward never is. But it is some of the most important work you'll ever do. Not just for your mental health, but for your relationships, your goals, and yes, even your English learning. Because your ability to express yourself in another language is deeply connected to how freely you can think, how clearly you can feel, and how compassionately you relate to yourself. So as we move forward in this episode, I invite you to stay curious. Be kind to yourself. This isn't about perfection. It's about becoming conscious of the invisible systems that run your life. And once you become conscious, you begin to get your power back. The enemy within, limiting beliefs, and inner saboteurs. So far, we've explored the idea that there's a silent battle happening inside all of us, and we've started to understand the mental terrain where that battle takes place. But now it's time to get really honest, because if you want to win that battle, you need to recognize one very uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, the enemy isn't out there. It's in here. It's not always your circumstances that are holding you back. Sometimes, it's your own mind, your own voice, your own beliefs. Let's talk about limiting beliefs. Now, this is a term you might have heard before, especially in psychology or personal development spaces. But what does it actually mean? A limiting belief is a thought or idea that you accept as true, but that in reality limits your potential. It's a mental filter that says, "You can't do that," or "That's not for people like you." These beliefs are rarely based on fact, but they feel real because they've been repeated so often inside your head that they start to sound like truth. And where do these beliefs come from? That's the tricky part. They don't appear out of nowhere. Most of the time, limiting beliefs are planted early, by something someone said or didn't say, by how we were treated, what we saw, or even what we misunderstood. Maybe you were told as a child that you were not creative, or not smart enough, or that failure is something to be ashamed of. Or maybe no one ever said those exact words, but somehow you felt it. And now, years later, even if your life has changed, that old belief is still whispering in the background. That whisper, by the way, has a name. It's often called the inner critic, that judgmental voice in your head that loves to point out your flaws. It tells you you're not prepared enough. It compares you to others. It reminds you of every time you messed up. And worst of all, it sounds like your own voice, which makes it harder to question. But let me ask you something that might stop you in your tracks. Whose voice is in your head? And is it really yours? Or is it something you've absorbed from a parent, a teacher, a boss, or even from society itself? Now, one of the most common forms of this inner enemy is something known as imposter syndrome. If you're not familiar with that term, let me explain. Imposter syndrome is the feeling that you're secretly not good enough, and that sooner or later, people will find out. It's that belief that your success is just luck, that you don't really deserve to be where you are. And it's surprisingly common, especially among high achievers, people in competitive fields, or anyone stepping into a new role or environment. You might be doing everything right on the outside, performing well at work, passing your exams, speaking fluent English. But inside, you feel like a fraud. And the fear of being exposed can be emotionally exhausting. Another way this inner enemy shows up is through self-sabotage. This happens when your actions, or your lack of action, actually get in the way of your own goals. For example, maybe you procrastinate even though you care deeply about the result. Maybe you avoid opportunities because you're afraid of being judged. Or you talk yourself out of taking a risk, not because it's impossible, but because a quiet voice inside says, "Why bother? You'll probably fail anyway." This is the most painful part of the inner war, when you begin to stand in your own way. And what makes it worse is that all of this can look completely invisible from the outside. People might see you and think you're confident, capable, successful. But inside, you're constantly second-guessing yourself. You're exhausted from overthinking. You're anxious before meetings, even when you've done your homework. You're working hard, not just to succeed, but to hide the part of you that feels like you're not enough. And this, by the way, is incredibly common in modern professional life. The pressure to appear polished, productive, and permanently positive creates a mental environment where these limiting beliefs thrive. Especially in international environments, where you're speaking a second language, adapting to different cultures, and constantly being evaluated, it's easy for the inner critic to get loud. So what do we do about it? Well, the first step is awareness. And part of awareness means asking tough, honest questions, like, what beliefs are shaping my actions? Are they based on truth? Or on fear? Where did these beliefs come from? And do they still serve me? Sometimes we're carrying mental programs that are completely outdated, like old software running in the background, slowing everything down. The good news is, beliefs can be updated, but only if you catch them first. You might also begin to challenge your inner critic by changing the way you speak to yourself. This doesn't mean turning into some overly cheerful motivational speaker in your own mind, but it does mean practicing a bit more self-compassion. Instead of saying, "I always mess things up," you might say, "I didn't get it right this time, but I'm learning." Instead of thinking, "I'm terrible at presentations," maybe try, "I'm nervous, but I'm prepared. And every time I do this, I grow." Small shifts in language can lead to big shifts in mindset. So here's something you might reflect on today. What's one belief you've been carrying, silently, for years, that might be holding you back? And if you could talk to that belief as if it were a person, what would you say to it now, as the person you are today? Would you accept its words blindly, or would you finally push back? The truth is, you are not your thoughts, and you are definitely not your limiting beliefs. You're the one hearing those thoughts. You're the one deciding what to do with them. And that is where your power lies. We'll continue this journey in the next part, where we'll explore how to become more aware of those thoughts without getting lost in them. But for now, just sit with this idea. The enemy within is not your enemy at all. It's a younger version of you, trying to protect you from something it didn't know how to face at the time. Now, as an adult, as a learner, as someone growing into a fuller version of yourself, you get to respond differently. and that changes everything. Weapons of awareness. Noticing without judging. So far, we've explored the inner battlefield, the invisible terrain shaped by our beliefs, habits, and emotions, and we've looked closely at some of the enemies we carry inside: limiting beliefs, self-sabotage, the inner critic. But now comes the most important turning point in this journey. Because if we want to stop reacting from fear and start responding from clarity, we need to develop one crucial ability: awareness. And I want to be very clear here. When I say awareness, I don't just mean knowing what's happening around you. I'm talking about a deeper kind of noticing. The kind of self-awareness that lets you see your thoughts while you're thinking them. The ability to observe your emotional reactions before they take over your behavior. The quiet space where you recognize, this is that old pattern again, instead of just falling into it automatically. This is where we enter the world of mindfulness, which, contrary to popular belief, isn't about sitting cross-legged on a mountain or trying to empty your mind. At its core, mindfulness simply means paying attention, intentionally and without judgment. It's the practice of noticing what's going on inside you, your thoughts, your feelings, your physical sensations, without immediately labeling them as good or bad, right or wrong. And this kind of noticing creates space. Space to breathe, space to think, space to choose a different response. It might sound simple, but it's incredibly powerful. Because most of us live in a constant cycle of reaction. Something happens, and we react. A message arrives, and we respond instantly. A stressful thought appears, and we believe it without question. There's very little pause, very little reflection, but awareness introduces the pause, and in that pause, everything can change. Instead of reacting out of habit, you can respond with intention. Instead of being controlled by your emotions, you can listen to them, and then decide what to do next. This difference between reaction and reflection is subtle, but essential. Reaction is fast, automatic, often emotional. Reflection is slower, more thoughtful, more deliberate. Think of it like this. Reaction is a reflex. Reflection is a choice. One comes from the unconscious mind, the other comes from conscious awareness. And the more we practice pausing before we act, the stronger that awareness becomes. Now, one of the most effective tools for building this awareness is something very simple, and yet deeply transformative: journaling. Writing down your thoughts, even for just 5 or 10 minutes a day, can help you see what's going on inside your mind with more clarity. You don't need to write perfectly. You're not writing for anyone else. You're simply allowing your thoughts to come out of your head and onto the page, where you can look at them more objectively. Sometimes, the act of writing itself helps you realize, oh, I've been carrying that fear all week. Or, that belief isn't even true. It just feels true when I don't question it. When you see your inner dialogue written out in front of you, it becomes easier to challenge it, or reframe it, or simply let it go. Another tool that supports awareness is stillness. And I know, in a fast-moving world, stillness can feel unnatural, even uncomfortable. We're so used to doing, to producing, to consuming information, content, stimulation, that sitting quietly with our own thoughts can feel strange. But stillness is not about inactivity. It's about presence. Even 1 minute of conscious breathing, just noticing the breath as it moves in and out, can help reset your nervous system and bring you back to the present moment. It's in this space of stillness that you begin to hear your thoughts more clearly. You begin to separate what's actually happening from the story your mind is telling about it. And when that happens, you can begin to name what you're feeling. Which brings us to another essential skill: naming your emotions. It might sound basic, but being able to identify what you're feeling precisely, not just vaguely, is one of the cornerstones of emotional intelligence. Saying, "I feel bad," is a start. But what kind of bad? Are you frustrated, disappointed, overwhelmed, lonely, insecure? The more specific your language, the more insight you gain. And as your emotional vocabulary expands, in English or in your native language, your self-awareness deepens too. This is also where language learning and personal growth intersect. Because sometimes the exact word you need to describe what you're thinking or feeling doesn't exist in your first language. And when you discover that word in English, it opens up a new part of your internal experience. So, learning emotional vocabulary isn't just about communication, it's also about connection. Connection with others, yes, but also with yourself. Now, I know this process can feel a bit abstract at first. It's not as concrete as grammar rules or pronunciation tips. But here's the truth. Without awareness, no lasting change is possible. You can read all the productivity books in the world. You can try every new habit or mindset hack. But if you're not aware of the thoughts and emotions that drive your behavior, you'll just end up repeating the same patterns in slightly different ways. So I invite you gently to start practicing the pause. Notice your thoughts. Notice your emotional shifts. Ask yourself, from time to time, what's really going on in my mind right now? Not to judge it, not to fix it, just to witness it, clearly and kindly. Because awareness is not weakness, it's not passivity. In fact, it's the opposite. Awareness is your first weapon in the silent battle. A tool that brings light into dark corners, that creates space where there was once only pressure, and that allows you to begin responding to life rather than just reacting to it. Take a deep breath. You're doing the work, quietly, steadily. And that matters more than you know. We'll continue soon with how to actually change the way you speak to yourself, and why your internal dialogue can either lift you up or quietly hold you down. Changing the script. Rewriting your inner dialogue. In the last section, we talked about awareness, the ability to notice your thoughts without immediately reacting to them, and that's a crucial first step. But once you've learned to observe what's going on inside your mind, the next challenge is this. What story are you telling yourself? And is it helping you grow or holding you back? In other words, it's time to look at your inner dialogue, the ongoing conversation you have with yourself, day in and day out. For many of us, this voice is so constant, so familiar, that we barely even notice it anymore. But the truth is, it's always there, giving us advice, making judgments, reminding us of our fears, replaying past mistakes, or setting expectations for the future. And here's the thing. How you speak to yourself matters. A lot. In fact, it shapes your confidence, your motivation, your emotional health, and even your ability to learn. If your inner dialogue is filled with criticism, doubt, or unrealistic pressure, then everything you do becomes more difficult. You start to talk yourself out of opportunities. You give yourself a hard time over small mistakes. You beat yourself up for not being perfect. And eventually, your mind becomes a place where you don't feel safe. Not because of the world outside, but because of the words you keep using inside. Let's pause for a moment and reflect on that. If you spoke to a friend the way you speak to yourself, what would happen? Would they feel supported and understood? Or would they feel judged, pressured, and constantly not enough? It's a powerful question, and one that many of us never really ask. Because we've been taught to be humble, to aim high, to push ourselves in order to succeed. But somewhere along the way, that healthy ambition can turn into self-rejection. We become our own worst critics, and we do it in the name of self-improvement. Now, this doesn't mean we should lie to ourselves or pretend everything is fine when it's not. Positive thinking isn't about ignoring reality. It's about choosing how we frame that reality. And that's where the idea of reframing comes in. Reframing is the practice of taking a thought, especially a negative or limiting one, and looking at it from a different angle. It doesn't change the facts, but it does change the meaning you give to them. And meaning, as we know, is everything. For example, imagine you've just made a mistake in a presentation. Your first thought might be, "I'm terrible at this. I always mess up." That's the old script, the automatic response. But with a little awareness, you can catch that thought and reframe it. Okay, I made a mistake, but I stayed calm, and now I know exactly what to improve next time. See the difference? One version shuts you down. The other version lifts you up. One makes you afraid to try again. The other gives you the courage to keep going. And yes, this takes practice. Changing your internal script is not about forcing yourself to be cheerful all the time. It's about becoming the kind of inner voice that supports your growth instead of tearing it down. You're not trying to become a motivational speaker inside your own head. But maybe you could become a good friend, a wise coach, a compassionate guide, someone who sees your flaws and your strengths and believes in your ability to learn from both. This is what we mean by narrative ownership. It's the idea that you get to choose, not necessarily what happens to you, but how you interpret it. And once you take ownership of your internal story, you begin to rewrite it in ways that serve your values, your goals, and your well-being. Let's bring this back to English learning for a moment. Have you ever said something like, "I'm just not good at languages"? Or, "I always forget words"? Or, "My accent is too strong. People probably don't understand me"? These are not just casual thoughts. These are scripts, repeated lines that, over time, start to shape your confidence and limit your progress. But what if you change the script? What if you said, "I'm still learning, but I've come a long way"? Or, "I might forget words sometimes. That's part of the process." Or, "My accent is part of who I am, and it doesn't make me less intelligent." These shifts may seem small, but over time, they build something incredibly important: self-trust. And once you trust yourself, even just a little more, you stop holding yourself back. You take more risks. You speak more freely. You make peace with the fact that progress is not always perfect, and learning is not a straight line. So here's something to try this week. When you catch yourself thinking something harsh or critical, pause and ask, "Is this the voice I want to live with? Is this thought helping me become the person I'm trying to be?" And if not, try rewriting it, gently, honestly, and with compassion. You don't have to force positivity, but you can offer yourself perspective. You can start to build a new script, one that recognizes your effort, your growth, and your humanity. And remember, the story you tell yourself isn't just a story. It becomes the lens through which you see the world. So choose your words, especially your internal ones, with the same care and kindness you'd offer to someone you love. Let's keep moving. Because in the next part, we'll talk about what it means to show up, again and again, even when it's hard, even when you don't feel ready. Because changing your thoughts is one thing, but resilience in action is where the real transformation begins. Resilience in action: how to keep showing up. We've talked a lot so far about the silent battles we fight within ourselves, the thoughts we carry, the stories we tell, the voices we listen to. But there comes a point when mindset alone isn't enough. It's not just about thinking differently. At some point, it becomes about acting differently. That's what this part is about. What it really means to keep going, even when things feel hard, messy, or uncertain. This is where resilience comes in. Now, resilience is a word that gets used a lot these days, especially in professional development, education, and even mental health. But let's take a moment to look at what it actually means. Resilience isn't about being unaffected by challenges. It's not the absence of pain, fear, or failure. In fact, resilient people do feel all those things. What makes them different is that they keep showing up anyway. They fall down, they get discouraged, they doubt themselves, but they don't stay there. They keep going, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's unclear, and even when they don't feel ready. Think about this in your own life. Maybe there was a time when you really wanted to quit something, a course, a job, a relationship, a personal goal. Maybe the obstacles felt overwhelming, and maybe you even gave up for a while. But something brought you back. Something helped you hang in there, even when it was tough. Can you remember what that was? Sometimes it's internal, a deep personal value, a sense of purpose or a belief that this matters. Other times it's external, the support of a friend, a mentor, or even just the memory of a time you overcame difficulty before. But regardless of where it comes from, that inner push, that moment when you say to yourself, "I'm not giving up yet," that's resilience in action. Let me tell you a story, a simple one, but a real one. A few years ago, I decided to start recording content in English. I had ideas, passion, and a desire to help others, but also a lot of self-doubt. Every time I listened to my own voice, I cringed. I thought, who am I to do this? There were days when I was ready to delete everything, but something in me said, just keep going. Don't quit on a bad day. So I kept showing up, sometimes with shaky confidence, sometimes with very little energy, but I showed up. And over time, it got easier. Not perfect, but easier. And that's the thing. You don't build resilience all at once. You build it choice by choice. There's a phrase in English that really captures this spirit. Hang in there. It's what we say to someone who's struggling, who's facing something difficult. It's not a promise that everything will get better immediately. It's simply a way of saying, don't give up yet. Stay with it. You're stronger than you think. Another useful phrase is bounce back. Resilient people don't avoid falling. They just recover faster. They learn to bounce back from disappointment, from rejection, from mistakes. It doesn't mean they're immune to pain. It means they've learned how to move through it without letting it define them. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is just show up. Even when you're tired, even when you're not at your best, even when you're scared. Showing up doesn't always mean doing something big. It can be something as small as opening your notebook, practicing 5 minutes of English, having a difficult conversation, or simply not giving up today, and then doing it again tomorrow. But let's be honest, perseverance isn't glamorous. It's not shiny or exciting. It often feels boring, frustrating, repetitive. Discipline doesn't always look like motivation. In fact, it usually shows up when motivation disappears. And that's why emotional endurance, the ability to sit with discomfort and still act in alignment with your goals, is such a powerful skill. It's not easy, but it is learnable. And the truth is, many of us have been taught to chase results. Quick wins, fast feedback, instant success. But real growth is often slow, sometimes painfully slow. You'll take 2 steps forward and 1 step back. You'll doubt whether your efforts are making any difference. You'll feel invisible. But still, you keep going. And over time, those small, quiet acts of resilience add up to something solid, something lasting. They become part of who you are. So here's a question for you, a real one. Can you think of a time when you didn't give up, even though it would have been easier to walk away? What helped you through it? What part of you said, "I'm not finished yet"? And how can you connect with that same part of yourself now, today? Because here's what I believe. Resilience isn't about being extraordinary. It's about being consistent. It's about learning to trust yourself, not just when you feel strong, but especially when you feel vulnerable. And it's about making a quiet decision, again and again, to keep showing up, even when no one is watching. So, whatever you're going through right now, whether it's language learning, personal growth, or just navigating life, I want you to remember this. You don't have to be perfect to keep going. You just have to be present. You don't need to have all the answers. You just need to take the next step. Because in the end, resilience isn't something you have. It's something you practice. One choice, one action, one day at a time. We'll explore that even more in the next part, where we look at how your environment, the people, habits, and spaces around you, can either support your growth or quietly sabotage it. But for now, just breathe and remember, you've made it this far. And that already says something powerful about you. The quiet victories. What progress really looks like. So far, we've explored the internal struggles that shape us, the beliefs we carry, the way we speak to ourselves, and the resilience it takes to keep showing up. But now, it's time to slow down and take a different kind of look at progress. Because in a world that constantly rewards speed, visibility, and performance, we can easily forget something important. Not all growth is loud. Not all progress is obvious. And most success doesn't look the way we expected it to. Let's start by redefining what success even means. When we think of success, we often picture big, visible achievements. Landing a dream job, speaking English fluently in front of a large audience, publishing a book, reaching a financial goal. And yes, these moments matter. They're meaningful, but they're not the whole picture. In fact, they're often just the result of hundreds of smaller, quieter wins that no one ever sees. And if we only measure our progress by external rewards, we risk overlooking the powerful internal milestones that tell us we're actually moving forward. So what does real progress look like? Sometimes it's simply showing up when you don't feel like it. Sometimes it's choosing not to quit, even when you're discouraged. Sometimes it's saying no to something that drains you, or saying yes to something that scares you. And sometimes it's just being a little more kind to yourself than you were last week. These are victories, even if they don't earn applause, likes, or certificates. The problem is, we often don't recognize them. Why? Because we've been conditioned to associate growth with perfection. We think, if I'm still struggling, I must not be improving. But the truth is, struggle is often the clearest sign that growth is happening. You're pushing beyond what's comfortable. You're rewiring habits. You're unlearning patterns that have shaped you for years. And that kind of work? It's rarely neat. It's rarely fast. And it's almost never linear. Let me explain what I mean by not linear. We often imagine personal or professional development as a straight line, step by step, always upward. But in reality, growth looks more like a messy graph. Progress, setback, progress, plateau, confusion, clarity, progress again. And that's completely normal. If you've ever had the thought, I thought I'd be further along by now, or why am I still struggling with this? You're not alone. That's part of the process. Progress is not a straight road. It's more like a winding path, full of hidden turns and quiet breakthroughs. Here's another contrast we need to hold in mind: effort versus outcome. So often, we focus only on the result. Did I pass the test? Did I speak perfectly? Did I get the promotion? But what about the effort? What about the part of you that tried, that practiced, that faced discomfort and didn't run away from it? That effort, especially when it's consistent, is a huge sign of progress. And it's one of the things we most often overlook in ourselves. Let's bring this into a more personal context. Imagine someone learning English. Maybe they've been studying for years, but they still hesitate when speaking. Maybe they make mistakes or feel nervous in conversations. But what we don't see is that last year they were too afraid to even try. Or that last month they wouldn't have asked that question. Or that yesterday they would have given up. But today, they stayed with it. Those are quiet victories. And they matter. And here's the thing. No one else can define these victories for you. Only you know what cost you had to pay to keep going. Only you know how heavy it felt to take that small step. So if you're waiting for someone else to validate your growth, you might be waiting forever. Instead, learn to notice it yourself. Learn to name your own wins, no matter how subtle. Say to yourself, "This was hard, and I did it anyway." Or, "I handled that situation better than I would have a year ago." These are the kinds of reflections that build confidence. Slowly, but surely. And confidence, by the way, doesn't come from being perfect. It comes from being honest. Honest with yourself about where you are, how far you've come, and what you still want to learn. Confidence is built every time you keep going when it would have been easier to stop. Every time you speak up, even with shaky grammar. Every time you say, "I'm still learning," and mean it. So let me ask you, can you name a quiet victory from this past week? Something small, something no one else noticed. But you did. Maybe you stayed calm during a stressful conversation. Maybe you spoke English without translating in your head. Maybe you forgave yourself for making a mistake instead of obsessing over it. Whatever it was, hold on to that. Celebrate it. Not because it's big, but because it's true. Because at the end of the day, the most meaningful kind of progress is often invisible to the outside world. It happens in your choices, in your mindset, in your emotional reactions, in your self-talk. And these things, although quiet, are what create lasting change. We'll talk more in the next section about what it means to live from that place, to walk in alignment with your values, even when no one's watching. But for now, remember this: progress doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it whispers, and it's up to you to listen. Integration, living with yourself, not against yourself. So here we are, at the end of this journey, or maybe more accurately, at the beginning of a deeper one. We've explored the inner battle, the silent, invisible war that takes place inside our minds and hearts. We've looked at the patterns that keep us stuck, the voices we listen to, the stories we tell ourselves. We've talked about resilience, quiet victories, and the incredible power of self-awareness. But now we come to perhaps the most important question of all. What does it mean to live with yourself? Not against yourself. That question might sound abstract at first, but think about it. How often do we feel like we're at war with our own minds? Fighting our thoughts, judging our feelings, criticizing our behavior, trying to suppress the parts of ourselves we don't like. the insecurity, the fear, the jealousy, the anger. We try to push it all away, to silence it, to control it. But here's the hard truth. What we resist usually persists. The more we fight our inner world, the more intense it becomes. So what if we stopped fighting? Not in the sense of giving up, but in the sense of making peace, of choosing integration over suppression, of learning to understand ourselves rather than constantly trying to fix or punish ourselves. One powerful metaphor that speaks to this is the idea of befriending your shadow. In psychology, especially Jungian psychology, the shadow refers to the parts of ourselves we tend to hide, reject, or deny. Our weaknesses, our shame, our impulses. But here's the thing. The shadow isn't bad, it's just unacknowledged. And the more we ignore it, the more it controls us from behind the scenes. To befriend your shadow doesn't mean approving of everything you find there. It means being brave enough to look at it with honesty. And then choosing to respond with curiosity, not cruelty. Another way to say this is, become your own ally. Be someone who stands beside yourself, not against yourself. This doesn't mean you stop holding yourself accountable. It means you stop doing it from a place of judgment and start doing it from a place of care. Think about it. When a friend is struggling, you don't yell at them, do you? You try to understand. You offer compassion, you listen, and you help them move forward. What would change if you treated yourself the same way? This is where self-compassion comes in. And let's be clear, compassion is not the same as self-pity. It's not weakness. It's not letting yourself off the hook. In fact, compassion often takes more courage than criticism, because it asks you to stay present with your pain, rather than numbing it or pushing it away. It asks you to recognize your limitations without losing your sense of worth. And most importantly, it asks you to believe, even when it's hard, that you are still worthy of love, care, and respect, even when you're not at your best. That belief changes everything. Because when you live with yourself, as an ally, as a partner, as a whole person, you stop wasting energy on internal battles. You stop hiding parts of who you are. You stop chasing perfection and start honoring authenticity. And from that place, real transformation becomes possible. So let me ask you, what would change if you were truly on your own side? What would shift in the way you speak to yourself, in the choices you make, in the goals you set? If you knew that you had your own back, even on your worst days? Just imagine that for a moment. Imagine moving through life not as your own enemy, but as your own ally. It's not about never struggling. It's about struggling with dignity, with patience, with presence. And it's not about pretending to be someone else. It's about accepting who you are and gently expanding into who you're becoming. And yes, this takes time. Integration doesn't happen in a single moment. It's a practice, a way of living. It's in the small decisions, choosing rest instead of burnout, speaking kindly to yourself after a mistake, listening to your intuition even when logic says otherwise, noticing when your old patterns show up, and choosing, even briefly, not to follow them. So as we close this episode, I want to leave you with this thought. You are not a problem to be solved. You are a person to be met, fully, honestly, and with compassion. And the more you meet yourself, the more you befriend the difficult parts, embrace the beautiful ones, and accept the messy middle, the more whole, the more powerful, the more at peace you become. You've already begun the work. Just by listening, by reflecting, by being curious, you've taken a meaningful step toward living with yourself, not against yourself. And remember, in the silent battle, Your greatest weapon is not control. It's connection with your mind, with your emotions, with your deeper self. That's how the war is won. So take a deep breath. You don't have to fight so hard. You're allowed to be human. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. As we bring this episode to a close, I want to come back to where we began, with the idea of the silent battle, that quiet, internal war that so many of us are fighting every day, even if no one else can see it. The truth is, just being human means waking up each morning and facing some kind of inner challenge, a voice of doubt, a fear of failure, a past you haven't made peace with, or a future that feels uncertain. You don't need to be broken or dramatic to feel this. You just need to be alive. And if you're listening to this, it probably means that, in some way, you already know the battle I'm talking about. You've felt it. You've lived it. You may even be in the middle of it right now. And if that's the case, I want to tell you something simple but true. You're not alone. This is something we all go through, in different ways, at different times. No matter where you're from, what language you speak, what job you do, or what your goals are, you are part of this shared human experience. But here's what's even more powerful. You are not just a survivor of that inner battle. You are a warrior in it. A quiet warrior. And being a quiet warrior doesn't mean pretending to be strong all the time, or pushing down your feelings, or never making mistakes. It means choosing to keep going, even when it's hard. It means learning to face yourself with honesty, to respond with compassion, and to act with intention. Not once, but over and over again. This is not a one-time decision. It's lifelong work. And that's okay, because real growth doesn't come from rushing. It comes from returning to your values, your goals, your true self. Especially when things get noisy or confusing. You'll have days when you feel like you've lost progress. You'll fall back into old patterns. You'll forget to be kind to yourself. That doesn't mean you've failed. It means you're human. The goal isn't to win every single battle. It's to keep showing up for yourself, again and again. So as you go forward, remember this. You're already fighting. Every time you resist the urge to give up, every time you rewrite a negative thought, every time you take a small action toward something better, you're already doing the work. The invitation now is to fight well. Not with force, but with clarity. Not with judgment, but with purpose. Not against yourself, but with yourself. And if you want to take this reflection a step further, I'd like to offer a small activity. A journaling prompt you can try in English after this episode. Find a quiet moment. Grab a pen and a notebook, and write a letter to yourself. Not your future self, not your ideal self, but the version of you right now. Begin with the words, "Dear Quiet Warrior," and then let the words come. Speak honestly, gently, encouragingly. Write what you wish someone else would say to you, and say it to yourself instead. Because in the end, the way you speak to yourself is the battlefield. And maybe it's also the beginning of peace. If this episode resonated with you, if it gave you something to think about, feel, or reflect on, I'd love for you to share it. With a friend, a colleague, a fellow learner. Or simply return to it when you need a reminder that you are not alone in this process. You are not behind. You are not broken. You are becoming. And that matters. And if you'd like more thoughtful episodes like this, content that helps you grow both your English and your inner life, make sure to follow Code Your English on your favorite podcast platform. And leave a review if you can. It really helps more learners find this kind of content. Until next time, Take care of your mind. Speak kindly to yourself. And remember, you're already stronger than you think. You are, and always have been, a quiet warrior.